11 soldiers hit the floor in 12 minutes, crushed ribs, collapsed lungs, blood on every surface. The trauma team at Callaway General stood frozen, senior physicians, board-certified surgeons, men and women with decades between them, and not one of them moved first. She did. The travel nurse everyone had dismissed that morning, the woman the trauma director had called a temporary placement with boundary issues. She stepped into the wreckage without gloves on, started calling orders before anyone had a chart, and brought back men who were already slipping under. They all survived. She was fired the next morning. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like this one live. Stories about people who get counted out, pushed aside, and written off, and then prove every single person wrong in the most jaw-dropping way possible. Hit the like button if you're already feeling this one, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The morning started the way most mornings did at Callaway General Medical Center, with the smell of burned coffee from the third-floor break room and the particular tension that lived inside any large hospital running 10% below its staffing minimum. Nadia Reeves clocked in at 6:47, 13 minutes before her shift officially began, because she had learned early that late arrivals in a temporary contract meant a quiet conversation with scheduling that ended with your badge deactivated. She pulled her hair back in the elevator, checked her watch, and did a fast mental inventory of what she remembered from the previous shift's handoff notes. 2 patients in Bay 4 and 7 still waiting on imaging. 1 in Bay 11 who'd been flagged for behavioral concerns. The kind of morning that looked manageable until it didn't. She was 32 years old, and she had been a travel nurse for 3 years. Before that, she'd been something else entirely. Something she kept in a file folder she never opened anymore, tucked behind her nursing certifications and her lease agreement, and the small stack of personal documents that traveled with her from city to city. Callaway General was her 4th placement in 14 months. Tidewater, Georgia wasn't a city she'd planned to stay in, but the hospital had a solid trauma unit and a staffing contract that paid well. And Nadia had stopped making long-term plans around the same time she stopped sleeping more than 5 hours at a stretch. She reached the trauma bay on the 2nd floor and found the night nurse, a compact, exhausted woman named Farah, already waiting with her coat on. "Anything I need to know?" Nadia asked. "Bay 3 is going to want pain medication the second you walk in. Don't let him guilt-trip you into anything before the attending signs off." Bay 9 had a rough night. "Vitals are stable, but she's not comfortable." Farah grabbed her bag. "Oh, and Dr. Merritt's in early." Nadia kept her expression neutral. "Good to know." "Is it, though?" Farah said, already heading for the door. Dr. Garrett Merritt was the trauma director of Callaway General, and he had the specific energy of a man who had been told he was exceptional so many times, and from such an early age that he had simply accepted it as physical law. He was 46, broad-shouldered in the way that suggested he'd played football somewhere and still thought about it, and he ran the trauma department with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once been the least qualified person in any room he'd entered. He didn't like Nadia. He had made this clear without ever saying it directly, which was its own skill set. He scheduled her for the covered shifts nobody wanted. He addressed her as the temp in departmental meetings. He had, twice, asked her within earshot of other staff whether she was certain about a clinical call she'd made. Both times, she had been correct, and both times he had moved on without acknowledgement. She did her job. She did it without complaint, and without the kind of visible resentment that would give him something to point at. She had learned, in a previous life, that the most effective thing you could do in a hostile environment was become very, very good at your work and let that be the only thing anyone could say about you. The first 3 hours of the shift were standard. She medicated, assessed, documented, and communicated with the attending on 2 patients who needed updated orders. She found the man in Bay 3, as promised, attempting to charm her into an early dose of something the chart clearly indicated he wasn't due for until 10. "I'm in a lot of pain," he told her, with the practiced suffering of a man who had used that phrase many times. "I know," she said, "and I'm going to make sure Dr. Callisto sees your chart before 10 so we can talk about adjusting if you need it. Until then, let me get you something for the nausea, because that can make everything feel worse." He looked mildly disappointed that the sympathy play hadn't worked. "You're not from here, are you?" "No." "You sound military." She smiled at him, the kind of smile that answered nothing. I'll check back in an hour. She was charting at the nurse's station at 9:14 when the radio traffic started. It came through the charge nurse's walkie first, a fragmented transmission from EMS dispatch, something about a training accident at a National Guard facility 20 miles outside Tidewater. She heard the words multiple casualties and structural collapse before the charge nurse, a veteran named Dwight, was already on the phone. "How many?" he said. Then, "What's their status?" Then a pause that told her everything. "We'll be ready." He hung up and looked around the floor. 11 incoming, he said. "Training exercise." Building came down on them. First units are 8 minutes out. The trauma bay went into the particular organized scramble that emergency departments run on muscle memory. People moved, crash carts were repositioned, on-call surgical was paged. The attending on duty started pulling on gloves while a charge nurse called upstairs to alert the OR. Nadia moved to her assigned position and waited. "Doctor." Merritt appeared from the direction of his office, already in scrubs, already carrying the authority of a man who understood that a mass casualty event was also, if handled well, a very visible professional moment. "I want a clear chain of command on this," he said to the room. "Everything goes through me or through Dr. Solis. Nobody improvises. We work the protocol." He looked at Nadia briefly, with the specific look that communicated she should stay in her lane. She said nothing. The first ambulance arrived at 9:22. The soldier inside was 23 years old with a suspected tension pneumothorax. His trachea had already begun deviating, his breath sounds on the right were nearly absent, and his blood pressure was dropping. The paramedic was calling it out as they rolled him in, and Nadia was already at the gurney before it cleared the bay doors, her hand going to his neck to feel the tracheal shift while she listened to what the medic was telling her. "Right side," she said. "We know," said the paramedic. "BP was 80 on the way in." "How long?" 12 minutes since we loaded him." She looked up for the attending. Dr. Solis was 3 bays away, working the second incoming, hadn't looked up yet. Merritt was at the far end of the bay, directing 2 nurses on a patient with a visible crush injury to the lower leg. The soldier's oxygen saturation dropped to 81 on the monitor. Nadia made a decision. She called for a 14-gauge needle, identified the second intercostal space on the right midclavicular line by touch and landmark, and performed the decompression before anyone had formally assigned her to the case. The rush of trapped air was immediate. His SATs began climbing within 40 seconds. The attending, Dr. Solis, arrived at her elbow 30 seconds later, took one look at the monitor, then at the patient, then at the needle still in place. "Nice catch," he said quietly, already assessing. The next 40 minutes were the kind of controlled violence that mass casualty situations always were, loud and fast and full of competing information, with moments of stillness inside individual bays that felt completely separate from the chaos in the corridor. Nadia moved between patients, assisted where she was needed, identified a developing compartment syndrome on a soldier in Bay 6 that the covering resident had initially missed, and spent 7 minutes with a young man in Bay 9 who was conscious and terrified and needed someone to stay close while his injuries were assessed. "You're going to be okay," she told him. "How do you know?" he said. His voice was very young. "Because you're talking to me," she said. "That means your airway is open and your brain is getting oxygen. Everything else we can work with." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he stopped hyperventilating, which was the immediate goal. By the time the last patient was stabilized and transferred, a soldier with a severe traumatic brain injury who was taken directly to surgical on arrival, all 11 had survived. 3 were in critical condition and would remain in the ICU for days. But they were alive. Nadia stood at the sink in the scrub room and washed blood off her forearms and thought about nothing in particular. It was a skill she'd developed the same way she'd developed most of her skills. By necessity, over time, through repetition in situations where the alternative was worse. She heard the door open behind her. "Reeves." She turned off the water, turned around. "Doctor." Merritt was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face was not the one she'd expected. "What you did in Bay 1, he said, the needle decompression. The patient was deteriorating. Dr. Solis wasn't positioned to— I'm aware of what happened, he said. I'm also aware that you were not the assigned primary on that case, that you made a unilateral decision in a mass casualty event without waiting for attending authorization." She looked at him. He had maybe 90 seconds before his pressure bottomed out completely. And you made a judgment call that was not yours to make. His voice was completely level. We have protocols. Those protocols exist for a reason. You're a travel nurse, Reeves, a temporary placement, and you decided in the middle of a critical event that your assessment was more important than the chain of command I established before that first ambulance arrived. She didn't argue. She recognized what was happening. She had seen this particular architecture before. The version of accountability that was really about something else, dressed up in procedure and framed in the language of safety. I understand, she said. I don't think you do. He uncrossed his arms. I'll be speaking to the staffing agency this afternoon. Your contract here won't be renewed. You'll finish out today's shift and then we're done. He left. She stood in the scrub room for a moment longer. Then she dried her hands, put her watch back on, and went back to her patients. She worked the remaining 4 hours of her shift with the same level of focus she'd brought to everything else. She did not tell anyone what had happened. She completed her documentation. She gave a full handoff to the evening shift nurse, answered every question the oncoming team had, and did not leave anything incomplete. At the end of her shift, she stopped at the staffing coordinator's desk and confirmed what Merritt had told her. Her badge access would be deactivated at midnight. The agency would be notified. The coordinator looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Nadia. I didn't... It's fine, Nadia said. I appreciate the placement. She meant it. She had meant it at every hospital before this one, too. She collected her things from the locker room, changed out of her scrubs, and walked out through the employee exit into the late afternoon heat of a Georgia October that hadn't gotten the message that summer was over. She sat in her car for a minute with the engine off. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. She took it out, looked at it, and then set it face down on the passenger seat. She had 2 phones. One was the regular kind that normal people carried. The other was something different, a modified device with encrypted firmware and a contact list that most people would find alarming. She kept it off unless she had a specific reason to turn it on, which she had not had in a long time. She kept it in a waterproof case at the bottom of her bag, underneath a change of clothes and a first aid kit that was more comprehensive than anything a civilian travel nurse would typically carry. She drove back to the extended stay motel on the edge of Tidewater where she'd been living for 6 weeks, stopped at a gas station for a sandwich she didn't particularly want, and sat on the edge of her bed eating it while the local news ran on the television with the volume low. The training accident made the news. 11 soldiers, a structural failure during a simulated exercise. All 11 survived. There was brief footage of the exterior of Callaway General, a statement from the hospital's communications director, and then a cut to sports. They did not mention anyone by name. She thought about that for a moment. Then she set the rest of the sandwich aside, took the second phone out of her bag, and turned it on for the first time in 4 months. The startup sequence ran. The secure messaging application loaded. There were no new messages. She held the phone for a moment, looking at the blank inbox, and was almost relieved. She was about to power it down again when the notification appeared. Not a message, but a system alert from the encrypted network, the kind that came from automated monitoring rather than a human contact. It flagged a name. She read the name twice, slowly, to make sure she was reading it correctly. Damon Stroud. The phone felt suddenly heavier in her hand. She set it on the bedside table and stared at it for a long moment. Damon Stroud had been a defense contractor, logistics and medical supply procurement, officially. What he actually was, what she knew him to actually be, was something that had never made it into any official report, because the operation where she'd first encountered his name had been classified at a level that meant she couldn't discuss it with anyone who hadn't already been read in. She had spent 18 months trying to make sure certain information reached the right people. She had been told, eventually, that the matter was being handled through proper channels. That had been 2.5 years ago. The system alert didn't tell her what had triggered it. It only told her that Stroud's name had appeared in an active intelligence flag. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up the phone, opened the secure map application, and looked at the geographic marker attached to the flag. It was 11 miles from where she was sitting. She closed the application, looked at the wall, looked at the half-eaten sandwich. Of course, she said aloud to nobody. She got up and opened the closet. Behind her hanging clothes, on the shelf above the luggage rack, was a hard-sided case with a combination lock. She hadn't opened it since she'd arrived in Tidewater. She turned the dials, lifted the lid, and looked at what was inside. She stood there for a moment, assessing. Then she reached in. The drive took 20 minutes on rural highway heading northwest out of Tidewater, and then another 8 minutes on a county road that turned to gravel before it reached the chain-link perimeter of what the property records described as a decommissioned agricultural processing facility. She'd pulled the parcel data in the car using a mobile uplink, not because she expected it to tell her much, but because old habits from a previous life meant you always confirmed what you were walking into before you walked into it. The facility was dark. 3 vehicles were parked near the southern loading dock, none of them marked. The main structure was a long prefabricated building, and the loading dock doors were closed. One side door was slightly ajar, which was sloppy. She had parked a quarter-mile back and come on foot through the tree line. The night was overcast, temperature in the low 50s, enough cloud cover that the ambient light from Tidewater barely reached out here. She moved slowly. She was not in a hurry, because people who rushed in low-information situations made noise, and noise was a problem. She reached the side of the building and waited for 2 full minutes, listening. She heard a voice, then a sound that wasn't a voice. She moved to the ajar door and looked through the gap. The interior of the building was lit by 2 portable work lights set on the ground, the kind construction crews used. The shadows they cast were long and strange. In the center of the floor, a man was seated in a metal chair with his wrists secured behind him. He was wearing civilian clothes, but holding himself the way people with military training held themselves even when they were hurt, spine straight, eyes controlled, giving away as little as possible. 2 men were standing nearby. A third was on a phone call at the far edge of the light. She assessed the man in the chair for injuries, facial lacerations, favoring the left side. Alert. She assessed the 3 others. Weapons visible on 2. Positioning loose. They weren't expecting anyone. She looked at the man in the chair again. She made a decision. Behind her, in the tree line, something moved. She spun low and fast, dropping her weight to her right knee before she'd consciously decided to move, her left hand already coming up in a guard position. And then she stopped. It was a raccoon. It pushed out from between 2 fallen branches, looked at her with the specific lack of concern that raccoons reserved for all situations, and then moved on into the dark. She stayed on one knee for 3 full seconds, breathing through her nose, letting her heart rate settle. Then she stood, rolled her shoulders once, and looked back through the gap in the door. Nothing had changed inside. The man in the chair was still upright. The 3 men were still positioned the same way. The one on the phone had moved slightly closer to the work lights, and she could see his face now, mid-40s, heavy-set, the kind of jaw that suggested he'd spent time somewhere that hardened people. She did not recognize him. She recognized what he represented. She spent another 40 seconds watching the interior, mapping it properly this time. Concrete floor. Structural columns on a 20-foot grid. Loading equipment shoved to the walls. Pallets. Empty shelving units. The rusting frame of a conveyor belt. 2 exits she could see. The side door she was at, and a larger roll-up door at the far northern end that was closed. She couldn't confirm a 3rd exit, but buildings like this typically had one on the east wall for fire code compliance, and she filed that under Assume It Exists. She pulled the door open just enough and went in low. The column nearest the door gave her cover for the first 15 feet, and she moved along the wall until she was behind a stack of empty pallets, close enough now that she could hear what was being said without straining. The man on the phone was wrapping up. "I said tonight," he said. "Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. Tonight." He ended the call and turned to one of the other 2. "He needs another hour." "He's not going to talk," the second man said, nodding toward the man in the chair. "They all talk," said the heavy-set one. "It's just a question of sequence." The man in the chair said nothing. His face was absolutely still, and Nadia thought, he's been trained for this. He knows what they want and he's running the clock, hoping something changes. She was what changed. The 3rd man was the problem. He was positioned roughly 8 feet to the left of the chair, and she'd have to move through open floor to reach him, which meant she needed the heavyset man and the second one neutralized first, in fast sequence, before the 3rd one could react. The geometry was workable. Not comfortable, but workable. She waited for the heavyset man to take 2 steps toward the chair. He was going to crouch down. She could see it in the way he was already shifting his weight, a posture people took when they intended to say something at eye level. And she moved. The second man was closest to her. She came in from his left side and behind, and it was over in 4 seconds. He went down without making any sound that would have carried over the ambient noise of the building. The heavy-set man started to turn, heard something that wasn't right, and had just begun to bring his weapon up when she was already there. And then he wasn't a problem either, though it took longer than she wanted, and she caught an elbow on her left cheekbone that she'd think about later. The third man by the chair had his weapon out. "Don't," she said. She was breathing harder than she'd have liked. He was young, younger than she'd assessed from outside, maybe 26. And he was scared, which was actually the most dangerous configuration, because scared people with weapons made decisions based on adrenaline rather than logic. "Put it down," she said. Her voice was even. She'd worked at that for years, in situations where the ability to sound calm was a tactical asset. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here for him." She indicated the man in the chair without moving her eyes off the young one. "You've got 3 seconds to make a good decision." 2 seconds passed. He lowered the weapon. She crossed the distance, took it from him, and told him to sit on the floor with his back to the east wall and his hands visible. He complied, which meant either his tactical training was poor or he'd correctly calculated that resistance was not a winning proposition. She decided it didn't matter which, and moved to the man in the chair. Up close, he was worse than he'd looked from outside. The laceration above his left eye had bled significantly and then partially dried. His left wrist had swelling around it that looked like either a fracture or a severe sprain, and he had the pale, slightly compressed look of someone who'd been through a sustained stress response and was running on whatever reserves he had left. She found a zip tie securing his wrists and cut it with the small blade she carried. He looked up at her. "Who are you?" "I'm going to ask you that in a minute," she said. "Can you walk?" He moved his hands around to his front, rotated his injured wrist carefully, and grimaced. "Yes." "Then we need to do that now." She helped him to his feet. He took most of his own weight, which was a good sign. She scanned the room once more, confirmed the 2 unconscious men were still down, noted the young one was still sitting exactly where she'd put him. "Move," she said. They went out the side door the way she'd come in, and she navigated him through the tree line by memory, one hand at his elbow to guide him over ground she'd already walked. He didn't speak during the quarter-mile back to her car, which she appreciated. People who asked questions while being extracted were a distraction from the business of getting clear. She got him into the passenger seat, started the car, and pulled out without lights for the first 100 yards, until the gravel road curved away from the facility's sightlines. Then she turned the headlights on and drove. "Give me your name," she said. "Marcus Webb." He said it without hesitation, which suggested he'd decided she was safe, or at least safer than the alternative. "Defense Intelligence, what's left of it." She processed that. "How long were you there?" "Since about 1400, 8 hours roughly." He shifted, favoring the wrist. "How did you find that location?" "Network alert. Your name wasn't attached. Damon Stroud's was." A pause. She heard him recalibrate something. "You know who Stroud is." "I know what he is," she said, "which is different." "What do you mean, what he is?" She watched the road. "I mean, I don't particularly care about his biography. I care about his operations. I ran into the edges of one of them about 3 years ago. Overseas. There was a supply irregularity that became a routing irregularity that became something considerably worse, and by the time anyone with authority to act on it was read in, 5 people I'd worked with were dead, and the paper trail had been cleaned." Webb was quiet for a moment. "What were you?" he said finally. "Before. Combat medic. 75th Support Group, attached to JSOC for the last 18 months of my service." Another pause, longer this time. "Reeves," he said. She glanced at him. "You know my name." "I know your file," he said, "or a version of it. There's a redacted assessment in a compartment I was read into 4 months ago. Your name is in it twice, once attached to a field operation in 21, once attached to a whistleblower report that was flagged, reviewed, and then buried." Her hands were steady on the wheel. "Buried by whom?" "That," Webb said, "is the specific question I've been trying to answer for 6 months." He looked out at the dark road. "The answer is what got me into that chair tonight." She turned onto the highway toward Tidewater and said nothing for a while. The engine noise was the only sound. "I need to know everything," she said eventually. "I know." Tonight, not tomorrow. I know that too, he said. He leaned his head back against the headrest, and she could see in the dashboard light that he was managing pain deliberately, keeping his breathing controlled, not letting himself slump. Your motel or somewhere else? Mine, she said. I need to think about a secondary location, but right now you need your wrist looked at and something to drink, and my first aid kit is there. You travel with a first aid kit. I travel with a comprehensive first aid kit. He made a sound that might have been a dry laugh. Of course you do. She got him back to the extended stay motel without incident, which felt like more than she deserved given the kind of evening it had already been. She parked in the back lot, away from the lights, and they went in through the side entrance. Her room was on the first floor, which she'd requested specifically because second-floor exits in a fire or a hurried departure were annoying. She sat Webb on the bed and looked at his wrist under the room's overhead light. Not fractured, the swelling pattern and the range of motion he still had argued against it, but badly sprained, with soft tissue damage that would hurt significantly worse by morning. She wrapped it tight with a compression bandage from her kit, gave him 2 ibuprofen and a bottle of water, and cleaned the laceration above his eye with proper irrigation and a few small closure strips. He sat through all of it without complaint, which she found she respected. When she was done, she sat in the room's single chair and looked at him. Talk, she said. Marcus Webb talked. He had been with the Defense Intelligence Agency for 9 years, and for the last 2 of those years, he had been embedded in a joint task force investigating procurement fraud in military medical supply contracts. It was unglamorous work, the kind that produced spreadsheets rather than arrests, that moved through bureaucratic channels at a pace that made geological processes look brisk. But it was important, because the numbers he was looking at were not small. The network he'd been tracking had been moving overpriced, sometimes counterfeit medical supplies through legitimate military contracting channels for at least 6 years. The mechanism was sophisticated. Shell companies layered through legitimate logistics firms, invoices for equipment that was either never delivered or delivered at 10% of its billed quantity, approval signatures from mid-level procurement officers who were either complicit or coerced. The kind of fraud that cost the Department of Defense tens of millions of dollars across a 5-year span and endangered soldiers who received substandard equipment in theater. Damon Stroud was the operational hub. He had started as a genuine logistics contractor in the early 2010s, built real relationships with real procurement offices, and then, around 2016, had begun leveraging those relationships for something else. I was smart enough not to get greedy fast, which was why he'd lasted this long. Where does Callaway General come in? Nadia asked. Webb looked at her. What do you know about it? I know I worked there for 6 weeks and got fired this morning. I know the trauma director approved equipment contracts. Merit, Webb said. She felt something settle into a colder shape. He's in this. Peripherally. He's not the origin point. He was recruited about 3 years ago, probably through someone he already trusted. His sign-off legitimized a procurement pathway that moved supplies into the hospital at inflated prices. Some of what came through that pathway also came with invoice diversion, where the military was billed for hospital equipment that the hospital was also billing for separately, double billing on medical supplies that were themselves overpriced to begin with. Webb shifted his injured wrist. He's not the most important piece. He's a junction point. Who recruited him? I don't know his name yet. I know his rank. Webb looked at her steadily. Brigadier General, active duty. Someone who's been inside the procurement oversight structure long enough to know exactly which audits to redirect and which reviewers to manage. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed in the parking lot, its headlights sliding across the curtains. You said my report was buried, Nadia said. The one from 3 years ago. Yes. Someone with that level of access could have done that. Yes, Webb said again. That's the connection I was trying to confirm when Stroud's people picked me up. He paused. What was in your report? She looked at the wall for a moment, then back at him. I was treating casualties from a patrol that got hit. The medical supplies in our kit, tourniquet materials, chest seals, hemostatic dressing, 3 items came from a supply batch that had been substituted. The materials looked correct. They weren't. The tourniquet material on one kit failed under pressure. I noticed it because I was using it and it behaved wrong. And when I looked at the lot numbers afterward, they didn't match our manifest. She stopped. One soldier bled out. He might not have with functional equipment. Webb's jaw tightened. Did you report it at the time? Immediately. I was told it was an isolated manufacturing defect. The batch was flagged for review. I kept copies of everything and submitted a formal follow-up 6 months later, after I'd been stateside. 3 months after that, I was informed that the review had been completed and the matter was closed. It wasn't closed, Webb said. It was suppressed. I found your original field report in a secondary archive that was flagged for deletion 18 months ago. Someone tried to scrub it. The deletion completed on everything except one backup copy that survived because of a system migration glitch. He said it flatly, as if he'd processed the absurdity of it already and come out the other side. That backup copy is what brought me to Georgia. Nadia absorbed that. She thought about the year after she'd submitted that follow-up report. The specific grinding frustration of being told things were handled when she knew they weren't. The way she'd eventually made a pragmatic decision, she couldn't fix this from inside a system that was actively routing around her, so she'd taken her discharge, picked up her nursing credentials, and tried to build a version of a life that didn't require her to think about what she couldn't change. She'd been moderately successful at that, right up until tonight. I need to know what you found at the facility, she said, before they picked you up. What was in there? Webb reached into his jacket with his good hand and produced a small, encrypted thumb drive. Shipping manifests, hard copies that Stroud hadn't digitized because he didn't trust the network security. I photographed them before they found me. He held the drive up. 18 months of documentation, enough to trace every transaction in the network back to its approval source. He paused. Including the approval that suppressed your report. She looked at the thumb drive for a moment. You need to get that to your agency, she said. I need to get it to someone I trust at my agency, he said carefully, which is a smaller category than it sounds. Outside, another car moved through the parking lot, then a second one. She noticed something. The second car had moved slowly, very slowly, the way cars moved when they were reading building numbers. She stood up and went to the window without turning on any lights, staying to the side of the curtain. 2 vehicles, both dark-colored. Both parked now, one at each end of the parking lot, positioned to cover the 2 exits. She looked at Webb. How much time passed between when they took you and when I got you out? He understood immediately. 8 hours. Enough time to pull my digital trail. Your phone? I ditched it 4 days ago. He paused. But I used a rental car. She grabbed her bag. The hard-sided case was already open from earlier and she checked it fast. Everything still there, nothing missing. She closed and locked it, slung her main bag over her shoulder. They GPS tracked the rental, she said. Not to the facility, to this parking lot. She looked at him. My car's registered under my travel contract address. This motel. How many ways out of this room? He asked. He was already on his feet, moving well despite everything. Door, window to the interior courtyard, or we go up through the maintenance access on the east end of the building. She moved to the window on the courtyard side and looked out. Clear. Courtyard. There's a service exit on the north wall that comes out behind the gas station next door. Let's go, Webb said. She went first. They moved through the courtyard in the dark, keeping to the shadows along the building's edge. The service exit was a simple push-bar door that opened onto a narrow alley between the motel's rear wall and a chain-link fence. She went through it, Webb right behind her, and they came out beside the dumpsters behind the gas station's small convenience store. She stopped, listened. Nothing immediate. The vehicles were still in the front lot, which meant whoever had sent them was waiting, not breaching, which meant they either wanted to confirm she was inside before moving or they were waiting for more people. Either option gave her maybe 4 minutes. There's a woman I trust, Webb said quietly. She's at Fort Callaway. It's 20 miles north. Colonel Denise Abera, Inspector General's office. If I can get a message to her on a clean line. I have a clean line, Nadia said. She meant the encrypted phone which was in her bag. Give me the contact information and I'll initiate. But we need to move while I do it, not stand here. He gave her the information from memory. A number and a verification code phrase, the kind of thing trained people kept in their heads instead of on paper. She flagged it, tucked it away, and looked at the street beyond the gas station. A delivery truck was parked at the curb 3 businesses down. Hazard lights on, engine running, driver presumably inside making a drop. She looked at Webb. "Can you move fast if you need to?" "Yes," he said, without elaborating on what that cost him. "Then we move in 30 seconds. Stay behind me and don't stop for anything that isn't a direct threat." She reached into her bag and closed her hand around the encrypted phone. And that was when her fingers found something else. Something wrong, something that hadn't been there before. Tucked into the outer pocket of her bag, which she had left on the bed in her motel room during the 40 minutes she'd been looking at Webb's injuries and listening to him talk. She pulled it out. It was a small device, matte black, roughly the size of a pack of gum. She didn't need to examine it closely to know what it was. Someone had been in her room. Not the people in the parking lot. They'd just arrived. Someone earlier, someone who'd known she was here before tonight, before the facility, before any of this had started to move. She stood very still in the shadow of the dumpsters, holding the device, and rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last 6 weeks. She turned the device over once in her fingers, then closed her fist around it and thought hard for exactly 4 seconds. The tracker meant someone had physical access to her room, which meant either the motel staff had been compromised or someone had a key card they shouldn't have had. It also meant the timing was specific. She'd left for the facility around 9:30, which gave a window of roughly 2 hours before she returned with Webb. Someone had known she would be gone, which meant someone had been watching her before tonight, before the network alert, possibly before she'd even turned the encrypted phone on. 6 weeks. She'd been in Tidewater for 6 weeks. She dropped the tracker on the ground and stepped on it, not hard enough to make noise, just enough to kill the circuit. Then she grabbed Webb's good arm and moved. They went along the back of the gas station's property line, staying off the lit areas, crossed a narrow strip of dead grass to the access road behind a strip of commercial buildings, and reached the delivery truck in under 90 seconds. The driver was still inside the convenience store. She could see him through the window, talking to the cashier with the relaxed posture of someone with no particular urgency. The truck's engine was running and the cab was unlocked, which was either carelessness or Georgia, and she decided it didn't matter. "Get in," she said. Webb pulled himself into the passenger side while she went around and took the wheel. She didn't pull out immediately. She sat for 30 seconds, watching the mirrors, watching the street. Nothing moved from the motel's direction yet. She pulled out slowly, no sudden acceleration, nothing that would read as flight, and drove north. "The rental car," she said. "Where did you leave it?" "County Road off Route 9, about a mile from the facility." "They've already found it." She said it as fact rather than question. "Yes." "Then Fort Callaway is the wrong move right now. If they track the rental to the facility and the facility to the motel, they can track web-shaped activity heading toward the nearest military installation." She kept her eyes on the road. "I need to reach Colonel Ibarra on the clean line before we go anywhere with a gate guard." "Agreed." Webb was holding his wrapped wrist against his chest. The compression bandage was doing what it was supposed to, but she could tell from the set of his jaw that the pain had moved into a different register. That happened with soft tissue injuries. The first hour was survivable. The second hour was when everything started to stiffen, and the nerve signals caught up with what had happened. She filed it away. She drove for 12 minutes, putting distance and direction changes between them and the motel, before she pulled into the unlit back corner of a closed garden center's parking lot and took out the encrypted phone. She input the number Webb had given her and the verification phrase and sent it as a text, rather than initiating a call, because calls required real-time attention from both ends, and right now she needed her attention distributed. The response came back in 4 minutes. 2 words. "Confirm identity." She typed back the secondary verification Webb had also provided, a string of 8 characters that meant nothing on its own but confirmed she'd gotten it directly from him. 90 seconds. Then, Webb status. She typed, "Injured, mobile, material secured, compromised location, need clean channel and extraction point." The pause before the next response was longer, 2 full minutes. She watched the street. Then, "Stand by. Do not move to Fort Callaway. Acknowledge." She acknowledged. "She's responding," she told Webb. He exhaled slowly. "Denise is good. If she's responding directly, she's treating this as active. She told us not to go to Fort Callaway, which means she already knows the installation might be compromised." I was quiet for a moment. Or at least that she can't guarantee the gate to IG pathway is clean. How deep does this go? Nadia said. She was genuinely asking, not rhetorically. Webb looked out at the dark parking lot. I know of 8 confirmed participants in the procurement network across 3 installations. I suspect the number is higher. The Brigadier General I mentioned. I have a strong candidate. I've had him for about 6 weeks, but I needed the manifest to confirm the financial trail back to his office. He paused. I didn't want to move until I was certain, because if I moved on the wrong person, the right one would disappear everything and vanish. 6 weeks. The same 6 weeks she'd been at Callaway General. Give me the name, she said. Webb looked at her. There was a specific kind of calculation happening behind his eyes. The kind that happened when someone had been protecting a piece of information for a long time and was deciding whether the circumstances had changed enough to let go of it. Harlan Voss, he said, Brigadier General, currently assigned to the Joint Medical Logistics Command Oversight Division, based out of Fort Selden, Alabama, but he's been in this region 4 times in the past 6 months. She had never heard the name. She searched her memory anyway, the specific kind of slow, methodical search that went through faces and briefings and mess hall conversations from years ago, and came up with nothing. He wasn't visible to you because he didn't need to be, Webb said, reading her silence correctly. He works 3 levels above the transactions. Clean hands. That's what makes him effective and what makes him hard. The phone vibrated. Colonel Abra had sent a location, a private address in a town called Merritt's Ferry, roughly 30 miles northwest. Below it, 2 hours. Come alone if possible. If not, Webb only. Nadia read it twice. The instruction to come without Webb, if she could, was interesting. It suggested Ibarra was being careful about who knew what her location was, which was either professional caution or something more complicated. She wants us at a private address in Merritt's Ferry, she told Webb. She specified to come without you if possible. That's standard, he said. She's limiting exposure. She'll want to talk to me separately once she's confirmed the material. He paused. She's not going to cut you out. If she's read in on your file, she knows why you matter to this. Nadia put the truck in gear. They drove northwest on back roads, and she stopped once at an all-night gas station to swap the delivery truck for her own car, which she retrieved by a roundabout route that added 20 minutes but confirmed no one was sitting on it. The motel was dark when she passed it at distance. No visible law enforcement response, which meant the vehicles in the parking lot had either moved on or were maintaining a quiet presence, neither of which was good news, but neither of which was an immediate problem. Webb slept for 40 minutes in the passenger seat. She let him. He woke up when she turned onto a gravel road outside Merritt's Ferry, and he did it the way trained people woke up, eyes open and tracking immediately, hand moving before the rest of him, then settling when he confirmed where he was. Almost there, she said. The address was a farmhouse set back from the road, lights on inside. 1 vehicle in the drive, a civilian sedan with government plates that someone had not thought to remove, which suggested Colonel Ibarra had moved fast and prioritized speed over cover. A woman came onto the porch before Nadia had the car fully stopped. Mid-50s, tall, natural hair pulled back, wearing civilian clothes that didn't quite obscure the way she occupied space. The specific uprightness of career military even in jeans and a fleece jacket. She looked at the car, looked at Webb when he got out, and something in her face shifted briefly before it went back to neutral. You look terrible, she told him. I've had worse, he said. I know. She looked at Nadia. You're Reeves. Yes. Come inside. She said it to both of them, which told Nadia the come alone instruction had been precautionary rather than exclusionary. The farmhouse was someone else's, clearly unlived in recently, with the particular stillness of a property between occupants. And Ibarra had set up at the kitchen table with a laptop and a secure satellite phone. There was also a medical kit on the counter, which Nadia noticed and appreciated. They spent 90 minutes at that table. Ibarra went through the thumb drive's contents with the controlled focus of someone who'd spent a career reading financial documentation and knew exactly what she was looking at. She asked Webb questions that were specific and technical, and he answered them with the same precision. Nadia contributed twice. Once when Ibarra pulled up a supply routing document that referenced a batch number Nadia recognized from her field report, and once when Ibarra asked her to describe, in detail, what she had observed about the material's failure during that mission 3 years ago. She described it, all of it. The bandaging behavior, the lot numbers, the specific failure mode. She said it flat and clinical because that was how she'd processed it, and because 3 years of not talking about it hadn't made her emotional about it in the way people might have expected. It had made her precise about it, because precision was how she'd survived carrying it. Abara listened without interrupting. When Nadia finished, she closed the laptop and sat back. The batch number you just cited, Abara said. It appears 4 times in these manifests. All 4 instances show the batch is shipped to active theater units. All 4 show full billing for premium-grade materials. She paused. The actual materials were second-tier rebranded stock purchased at 40% of the build cost. The kitchen was very quiet. Your report, Abara continued, looking at Nadia, was suppressed because it would have triggered a batch audit that would have flagged all 4 shipments simultaneously. At the time, 3 of the 4 units hadn't yet received their shipments. A batch audit would have intercepted them. She stopped. Someone made a decision that protecting the financial pipeline was more important than pulling the shipments. Voss, Webb said. Almost certainly. I've had concerns about Voss for 8 months. I haven't had anything actionable. She looked at the thumb drive. This changes that. Nadia looked at her. What happens now? I moved this up through a channel I trust that bypasses Fort Calloway's IG pathway. That takes time, probably 24 to 48 hours before we have federal involvement. In the meantime, the people who came to your motel tonight are going to keep looking for you. Abara said it plainly. You can't go back to Callaway General, obviously, and I'd recommend against anywhere your name or contract information is on file. I don't have a lot of options that meet that criterion, Nadia said. I know. Abara looked at her for a moment. I'm going to ask you something that you can say no to. Ask. There's going to be a moment, probably in the next 18 hours, where I need someone to be physically present at Callaway General. I can't send agency personnel in without tipping our hand, and Fort Callaway is compromised as an asset. But a travel nurse who's already credentialed in their system, she stopped. Merritt fired me, Nadia said. Merritt's actions this morning are going to look very different to hospital administration in about 12 hours, once I make one specific call. Abra said it with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly how institutional authority worked when it was properly applied. You'd be reinstated, temporarily, and I'd need you to collect one thing. What thing? Merritt's network access is still active. We confirmed it this morning before any of this happened. He has a secondary file server that isn't accessible through the hospital's main network, accessible only through his office terminal. The procurement documentation on that server is the piece that ties Stroud's operation to Voss's approvals at the institutional level. Abara's voice was completely steady. Every other piece of evidence is circumstantial without that link. With it, we have the chain. Nadia thought about the hospital, about the trauma bay and the 11 soldiers, and the look on Merritt's face in the scrub room, about the way he'd said you forgot your place with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once been made to reckon with any consequence. Okay, she said. Abara looked at her for a moment. It's not safe. I know. Merritt is going to know you're not supposed to be there. He'll challenge you. Let him, Nadia said. Abara almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. Get some sleep, both of you. I need 4 hours to make the calls I need to make, and then we move. Nadia didn't sleep. She sat in a chair in the farmhouse's front room with her bag at her feet and the encrypted phone in her hand, and she went through everything she knew about Callaway General's internal layout, the location of Merritt's office, the access routes, the shift schedule pattern she'd memorized over 6 weeks without consciously deciding to. She mapped it and remapped it and found the gaps and thought about how to cover them. At 4 in the morning, Abara came into the front room with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the couch. She handed one to Nadia without comment. The call is made, Abara said. Federal involvement is confirmed. They'll be moving into position around the hospital by OH 900, but they won't enter until I give a secondary signal. What's the secondary signal? You, coming out with the documentation. Nadia drank the coffee. It was bad coffee, the kind that came from a can, and it was exactly what she needed. Tell me about Voss, she said. Abara considered it. He's been in logistics oversight for 14 years, decorated. He was considered for a 2nd star 8 months ago. The process stalled, which is what I think accelerated his timeline on some of these transactions. A man who thinks he's being passed over makes different decisions than a man who thinks he's still ascending. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. He's also smart enough to have built-in redundancy. If we take Stroud, he has a story. If we take Merritt, he has a story. What he doesn't have a story for is his own approval signatures on the documents Webb found, cross-referenced with the IG records I've been quietly building. He'll know Webb got out, Nadia said. He'll know someone helped him. Yes. Which means he's already thinking about countermeasures. Also, yes. Ibarra looked at her. There's something else. Voss has a contact at Callaway General that isn't Merritt. A second set of eyes. Someone lower profile. I don't know who it is. Which means when you go in this morning, someone in that building may be watching for you. Nadia thought about that. Thought about the faces she'd worked alongside for 6 weeks. The charge nurses, the attending physicians, the department coordinators. One of them. Possibly. I can work with that, she said. At 7:15, Ibarra's phone rang. She took the call in the kitchen, and when she came back, her expression had shifted just slightly. Not enough that most people would have caught it, but Nadia had spent a significant portion of her adult life reading faces in situations where reading them correctly had material consequences. What happened? Nadia said. There was an incident at Callaway General, chemical exposure, a maintenance contractor working on the HVAC system this morning. Early reports say 14 workers affected, possible phosgene exposure from a damaged industrial solvent compound. Ibarra's voice was controlled, but the undercurrent was clear. EMS is en route. The hospital is going into emergency intake mode. Nadia was already standing. That's a lot of patients for a trauma unit that's operating short-staffed. I know. They're going to need people. Nadia, this isn't about the documentation right now, Nadia said. Those are real patients. I know that too. Ibarra looked at her for a long moment. It also may not be coincidental. Nadia stopped. You think the incident is manufactured? I think Voss is a man who, when he needs a distraction or a reason to move personnel around inside a building, doesn't leave it to chance. Ibarra held her gaze. I don't know that, but I think it. The room felt suddenly smaller. If the chemical incident was manufactured, not a genuine accident but a deliberate action designed to create chaos in the hospital and provide cover for something else, then the patients coming in were real casualties of a manufactured crisis. People hurt specifically so that someone could move inside Callaway General while attention was directed elsewhere. Nadia thought about phosgene exposure. The presentation was deceptive. Initial symptoms were mild, sometimes nearly absent, and then 4 to 24 hours later, depending on concentration and duration, pulmonary edema set in, and people who'd felt fine started drowning from the inside out. The treatment window was specific, and the management was intensive, and most general trauma teams saw phosgene cases rarely enough that the clinical instincts weren't sharp. She picked up her bag. Tell your federal contacts to move their timeline up, she said, and get Webb somewhere safe that isn't this house. Where are you going? Where the patients are. She was already at the door. Have someone meet me at the hospital's east entrance at 10:30. Tell them to look for a woman in scrubs who walks like she's already been in a war. She drove fast. The scene at Callaway General's emergency bay was visible from 2 blocks away. 3 ambulances, a fire department hazmat unit, and the particular organized urgency of a facility ramping up for a mass casualty intake. She pulled into the staff lot using her original credentials, which still had 22 minutes before Ibarra's call to administration would finalize her reinstatement, and walked toward the emergency bay entrance with her bag over one shoulder and the confidence of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Even at 20 feet from the entrance, even with the bay doors wide open and the ventilation going, there was something under the antiseptic and the exhaust. Faint, slightly sweet, the specific quality that her training had cataloged a long time ago. The second thing she noticed was Merritt, standing just inside the bay entrance, directing intake with the focused authority of a man in his element, and then looking up and seeing her. The look on his face went through 3 distinct phases in about 2 seconds. Surprise, then calculation, then something she couldn't immediately name. Reeves, he said. You don't have access to... I'm reinstated as of 7:52 this morning, she said, walking past him. Call administration if you want to confirm it. She looked at the incoming gurney from the nearest ambulance. The patient was conscious but confused, Respiratory rate elevated, skin slightly flushed. What's their oxygen saturation? The paramedic called it out, 91 and dropping. She pulled on gloves from the supply rack beside the door and was already moving alongside the gurney. High flow O2, non-rebreather mask, 15 liters, she said to the resident who was scrambling to keep up. And I need to know his exposure duration. Sir, look at me. She put her face in the patient's eye line. How long were you in the area where the smell was coming from? Maybe 20 minutes, he managed. I thought it was just fumes. 20 minutes. She kept her face neutral. At that exposure duration, with the presentation she was seeing, she had somewhere between 6 and 14 hours before his lungs would begin filling. Maybe less. She worked. She moved through the incoming patients systematically, triaging with the specific efficiency of someone who'd seen mass chemical exposure before, in a context she wasn't going to think about right now. She redirected 2 patients who'd been initially classified as lower priority based on mild symptoms, because mild symptoms were the trap with this particular compound, and escalated their monitoring and treatment protocols over the objection of the resident covering them. Their saturation is 94, the resident said. That's acceptable. It's acceptable right now, Nadia said. Come back in 4 hours and tell me how it looks. These 2 need continuous pulse ox, ABGs every 2 hours, and I want chest x-rays at baseline and at 4 hours. She met the resident's eyes. Phosgene toxicity is deceptive. The patients you're going to lose tonight are the ones who looked fine this morning. The resident looked uncertain, then nodded. Merritt appeared at her shoulder. You're out of your lane, he said, low enough that the surrounding staff didn't quite catch it. These patients need... I know what they need. What they don't need is a temporary placement making unilateral calls without... Dr. Merritt. She kept working while she spoke, not looking at him, hands moving through an assessment. You can file a complaint with administration after these people are stable. Right now, this man's breath sounds are starting to change. And if you want to argue about my credentials while that's happening, that's your decision. He went quiet. She heard him move away. She was writing updated orders on the 4th patient when she registered movement in her peripheral vision that wasn't the regular chaos of a busy trauma intake. 2 men in the corridor beyond the bay, moving with the wrong kind of purpose. Not medical staff responding to a crisis, not administration trying to manage the situation. They were moving toward the interior of the hospital, toward the administrative wing, and one of them she recognized. The heavy-set man from the facility. He was walking freely through Callaway General at 8:47 in the morning, which meant either his colleague had freed him faster than she'd estimated, or he'd been conscious longer than she'd believed, or both. She handed her clipboard to the nearest nurse. Keep updating those obs. Call me if saturation drops below 90 on either of the 2, I escalated. She followed the 2 men. They took the east corridor toward the administrative wing, and she stayed 40 feet back, using the foot traffic of a busy emergency morning as cover. They stopped at the elevator. She watched them board and noted the floor indicator. 4. Administrative Services. Merritt's office was on 4. She took the 4. She took the stairs. She came out on the 4th floor 30 seconds after the elevator would have arrived, which meant she was potentially behind them, and she moved quickly down the corridor toward the administrative suite. The floor was quieter up here. No patient care, mostly offices and conference rooms, a few staff moving with paperwork. She rounded the corner toward Merritt's office and stopped. The 2 men were outside Merritt's office door. The heavy-set one had his hand on Merritt's arm, and Merritt's face was the color of old paper. She couldn't hear what was being said from here, but she could see Merritt's expression, and it was not the face of a man talking to an associate. It was the face of a man being told something he hadn't expected, by people he didn't fully control, and realizing too late that the thing he thought he'd built his safety on was not actually going to protect him. She pulled back around the corner before any of them looked up. She needed the documentation from Merritt's office. The documentation was inside, and so were 2 men who had been at an illegal detention facility 12 hours ago. Merritt was with them, and whatever they were telling him was moving him toward a decision she couldn't predict. She reached into her bag and found the encrypted phone. She typed to Ibarra. 4th floor. 2 from facility are here. With Merritt. Need timeline. The response came back in 40 seconds. Federal team is 20 minutes out. Do not enter that office. She looked at her phone, looked at the corner she was standing behind, thought about the patients downstairs. The ones with the quiet, deceptive exposure that was going to turn lethal in hours if the monitoring protocols weren't maintained. Thought about the thumb drive in Webb's possession, and the manifests and the approval signatures, and the soldier who had bled out from a tourniquet that failed because someone had decided the financial pipeline was worth more than his life. 20 minutes. She put the phone in her pocket, and then Merritt's voice came from around the corner, suddenly louder, suddenly much closer, the voice of a man moving into the corridor. "I don't have it," he was saying, tight and fast. "I told you. The file isn't in my office terminal. It was migrated to—" "Then where?" The heavy-set man's voice. A pause. "It's in the hospital's secondary backup system," Merritt said. "Server room, sub-basement." Footsteps. All three of them, moving toward the elevator, moving away from her. She came around the corner and watched them go. If they reached the sub-basement server room and found the documentation, they would destroy it. The entire chain of evidence, the link between Stroud's manifests and Voss's approvals, would be gone. 20 minutes wouldn't matter. She looked at the elevator doors closing. She looked at the stairwell. She had 17 minutes and a head start if she moved right now, and a sub-basement she'd walked through twice during her 6 weeks here doing a medical equipment check with the facilities coordinator. A perfectly unremarkable thing that she had done while also, without making a conscious decision about it, memorizing the layout. She pushed the stairwell door open and went down. The sub-basement smelled of concrete and recycled air and the particular industrial hum of server infrastructure, and the lights were the kind of overhead fluorescence that turned everyone's skin gray. She came out of the stairwell into the main corridor and moved quickly toward the server room, which was behind a card access door at the far end. And the card she had was her reinstated staff badge, which she swiped without hesitation. The door opened. She was inside for 40 seconds before she found the secondary backup server array. 3 rack-mounted units along the east wall, with a network terminal on a rolling cart beside them. She powered up the terminal and began navigating to the administrative file structure, and she was 3 directories deep when she heard the sub-basement stairwell door open at the far end of the corridor. Footsteps. 3 sets. She looked at the terminal, looked at the door. She pulled a USB drive from her bag, clean, blank, the kind she carried for professional reasons that were now serving a different purpose, and she plugged it in and started the file transfer. The progress bar appeared, 14%. The footsteps reached the card access door. She heard a badge swipe. A pause. Another swipe. Merritt's access was active. She'd had the same thought Ibarra had, and now she understood why Ibarra had wanted this documentation urgently. The door opened. The heavy-set man came in first, and he saw her immediately, and his face did something complicated and fast. "Step away from the terminal," he said. Nadia looked at the progress bar. 61%. She did not step away from the terminal. "I said, I heard you," she said. She looked at him steadily. Behind him, Merritt had come through the door and was staring at her with an expression she'd seen once before, in the scrub room after the soldiers. But this time there was something added to it, something that looked almost like relief and almost like terror simultaneously. The second man moved to flank her left side. 61%. 62. "You have no idea what you're involved in," the heavy-set man said. "I have a pretty good idea," Nadia said. He moved toward her, and she made a calculation, and she moved first. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean. She hadn't claimed it would be. She took a hit to her right shoulder that was going to be a significant bruise by morning, and she put the second man down harder than she'd intended, and the terminal cart rolled sideways, and she had to catch it with her free hand to keep it from disconnecting. The heavy-set man stopped when he saw his colleague on the floor. He looked at her. He looked at the cart. He looked at Merritt, who was standing near the door with his back against the wall. "Dr. Merritt," Nadia said. She was breathing hard. "Sit down on the floor." Merritt slid down the wall and sat down on the floor. She looked at the terminal. 94%. The heavy-set man had his weapon out. She had hers in her right hand, shoulder aching, and they stood there in the gray fluorescent light of the sub-basement server room, while the progress bar moved in small increments and the building above them held 14 people who were going to start experiencing pulmonary distress in 4 to 12 hours if the protocols she'd set weren't maintained. 97. 98. The door at the far end of the corridor opened, not the stairwell she'd come from. The service entrance on the opposite end of the sub-basement that she hadn't seen from this position but had been in her mental map because she'd walked it once, 6 weeks ago, with a facilities coordinator who had talked the whole time about his daughter's soccer league. 4 people came through that door. They were not hospital staff, and they were not Voss's people either. The heavy-set man turned, recalculated, and made the wrong decision. The transfer completed at 99.8% and then jumped to 100, and Nadia pulled the USB drive with her left hand while her right hand stayed where it was. And she looked at the 4 people coming through the service entrance, and she looked at the heavy-set man, and she looked at Merritt still sitting on the floor. Then she looked at the door directly above the progress bar confirmation on the terminal screen. And the door to the stairwell she'd come through opened a second time, from the outside, and the person who walked through it was someone she had not expected. Brigadier General Harlan Voss walked through the stairwell door like a man who had rehearsed the entrance. He was 61, lean in the way that career military men who never stopped pushing themselves were lean, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that had probably been mandated by an institution for so long it had become structural. He was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a collared shirt, a jacket that fit well, and he carried nothing in his hands, which was its own statement. He looked at the room with the measured calm of someone who had walked into complicated situations before and understood that the first thing you projected was control, regardless of what you actually had. He looked at the 4 people who had come through the service entrance and something shifted in his face. Fractional, gone almost immediately. Then he looked at Nadia. "Sergeant Reeves," he said. She had never met him. He knew her rank. She filed both facts. "It's just Reeves now," she said. "I'm a nurse." "Of course." He looked at the heavy-set man who was still holding his weapon but had moved it to a less committed angle when the 4 people entered from the service corridor set. Because he'd made the same assessment she had, which was that those 4 people were federal, and you did not point a weapon at federal agents unless you'd already decided how that ended. "Marcus, put it down." The heavy-set man, Marcus, apparently, looked at Voss and then at the 4 agents and then lowered the weapon. An agent moved to him immediately. Voss watched that happen and then looked back at Nadia with an expression she could only describe as professionally disappointed, as if she'd made a social error he was willing to overlook. "You've caused a significant amount of disruption," he said. "I've been hearing that a lot lately," she said. He took a step into the room. "The material you think you've collected is going to be difficult to contextualize without understanding the full operational picture. What you found in those manifests is a complete financial trace of 6 years of procurement fraud connected to your approval signatures," she said. She kept her voice the same level it always was when she was managing a situation where the wrong kind of urgency would make everything worse. "I'm not interested in the contextualization." "You should be," he said, "because some of what's in those files represents legitimate black-budget operations that were sanitized through the commercial contracting pathway specifically to avoid congressional oversight. If you collapse that structure without understanding it, sir." One of the 4 agents from the service entrance had moved to a position near Voss, and the word was not deferential. "I need you to stop talking." Voss looked at the agent with the specific expression of a man who had outranked everyone in every room he'd entered for 20 years and was recalibrating in real time. He stopped talking. Colonel Ibarra came through the service entrance 30 seconds later. She was still in civilian clothes and she looked like she hadn't slept, which was because she hadn't, and she assessed the room in about 4 seconds. The heavy-set man being secured, Merritt on the floor, the second man still down, Nadia standing at the terminal cart with a USB drive in her hand and a right shoulder that was sitting wrong. "You're hurt," Ibarra said. "It's manageable," Nadia said. Ibarra looked at Voss. Something passed between them. Not familiarity exactly, but the specific recognition of 2 people who had been moving through the same institutional space for years from different directions. "Harlan," she said. "Denise." His voice was perfectly level. "You've made a significant mistake." "I make them occasionally," she said. "This isn't one of them." She looked at the lead agent. "Can we get this room cleared and establish a secure perimeter on this floor? I need the server array preserved as evidence, and I need medical staff down here to check on—" She looked at the man Nadia had put on the floor. "Whoever that is." "He's going to need an X-ray," Nadia said. "Possible fractured radius. He's breathing fine." Abara looked at her for a half second. Of course you know that. Occupational habit. The next 40 minutes were procedural in the way that the aftermath of things always was, structured and busy and full of the particular exhaustion that came after sustained high-stress operation, when the body started sending invoices for everything it had deferred. Nadia gave the USB drive to Abara directly, confirmed the chain of custody with the lead federal agent, and then stood against the wall in the sub-basement corridor while the room was processed around her and thought carefully about the 14 patients upstairs. She found a federal agent who wasn't actively managing something and told him she needed to go back to the emergency department. I'm not asking you to authorize my medical practice, she said. I'm telling you there are patients upstairs who have phosgene exposure and whose monitoring protocol I set up and who need someone to make sure it's being followed. 2 of them are going to look fine for the next several hours, and then they won't. She held his gaze. I'll stay in the department. I won't go anywhere else in the building, but I need to go now. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at Abara, who had heard the exchange. Let her go, Abara said. She went up. The emergency department was controlled chaos, which was the best version of what it could have been given the morning. Dwight, the charge nurse, looked up when she came back through the bay doors and did a fast read of her face. You look like you've been through something, he said. Little bit, she said. The 2 I escalated. Where are they? Bay 7 and Bay 12. 7's saturation dropped to 92 about 20 minutes ago. I was about to page. Good catch. She was already moving. Get me a repeat ABG on 7, and let's talk about early BiPAP, and I need the chest x-ray from Bay 12's baseline read. She worked for the next 2 hours. The patient in Bay 7 was a 44-year-old maintenance worker named Dale, who had the broad hands and the permanent squint of someone who'd worked outdoors for decades, and the specific bewilderment of a person whose body was betraying him in a way he couldn't see or feel yet. His oxygen saturation had continued to trend down, his work of breathing was increasing subtly, and the ABG when it came back showed early hypoxemia that the pulse ox reading had been understating. Am I going to be okay? He asked her, while she was adjusting his mask. She thought about the honest answer and the useful answer, and found a version of them that was both. Your lungs are irritated from what you breathed in, she said. We caught it early and we're treating it. The next 12 hours matter, so I need you to tell me immediately if your breathing feels harder, even a little. Don't wait until it's bad. Tell me when it's just different. He nodded. He looked scared in the specific way of people who weren't used to being scared. You've got people watching you, she said. That's not nothing. She moved to Bay 12. The patient there was younger, 26, one of the newer maintenance hires, according to the intake paperwork, and his initial presentation had been so mild that the covering resident had nearly classified him as observation only. His baseline chest x-ray showed what looked like early interstitial changes, subtle enough that you'd miss them if you weren't looking for them, which was exactly why she'd ordered it. She flagged both patients for ICU consultation and documented everything with the specificity of someone who understood that documentation in a contested situation was not bureaucratic formality, but a form of protection for the patients and for herself. At 11:20, Abara appeared in the emergency department. She found Nadia at the nurse's station, charting, and sat down in the chair beside her without preamble. Voss is in federal custody, she said quietly. The arrest happened approximately 90 minutes ago. He's invoking, which is expected. His attorney is already in transit. She paused. Marcus Tilden, the man from the facility and the server room, is cooperating. He lawyered up and then unlawyered faster than I've ever seen, which suggests his attorney had a frank conversation with him about the weight of what he's looking at. What does cooperation get him? Less than he deserves, probably more than nothing. That's not my decision. Abara looked at the department around them. Merritt is being interviewed. He's not cooperating yet, but he's also not a man who's particularly well suited for the experience of being on the wrong side of an interrogation table. I give him 72 hours before he decides that protecting Voss is worse than protecting himself. And Stroud? Federal warrant issued 40 minutes ago. He was located at a property in Beaumont County. He hadn't run yet, which I think means he didn't know how fast things moved this morning. She paused. He'll have lawyers. It'll take time, but the manifest, the financial trail, and the testimony we're already building, it's enough. It'll hold. Nadia finished a line of documentation and moved to the next field. The chemical incident this morning, she said. Was it manufactured? A pause. The investigation is ongoing. What I can tell you is that the solvent compound involved was in a storage area that requires a specific authorization code to access. And that code was used at 0400 this morning, well before the maintenance contractor arrived. She said it carefully. We don't have a confirmed answer yet. We may have one by tomorrow. Nadia thought about Dale in Bay 7, breathing through a mask, scared in a way he hadn't been yesterday. She thought about the 26-year-old in Bay 12 with the early interstitial changes on his X-ray. She didn't say anything about it because there wasn't anything productive to say right now. Your record at this hospital, Abara said. The termination this morning, that's being addressed. Hospital administration has been informed that Dr. Merritt's employment decisions made within the past 48 hours are under review, and your reinstatement is permanent pending your own decision about whether you want to stay. I don't know what I want to do yet, Nadia said honestly. That's a reasonable answer. Abara looked at her. There's going to be a debrief. Formal, federal, with a full review panel. Your name is going to be in the documentation, the suppressed report, the field observations, everything Webb's investigation cross-referenced with your service record. You're not going to be a footnote in this. Nadia looked up from the chart. I've been a footnote in it for 3 years, she said. I know. Abara met her eyes. That's what I'm telling you, not anymore. Abara left. Nadia went back to work. The afternoon moved the way afternoons in busy emergency departments moved, without a clear sense of time organized around patient states rather than clock positions, punctuated by small crises and quieter intervals. She checked Dale every 40 minutes. His saturation stabilized at 93 with the BiPAP and the treatment they'd started, and by 3 in the afternoon, the ICU team had taken him upstairs with a management plan she'd contributed to and that the intensivist had incorporated without the kind of friction she'd half expected. The patient in Bay 12 was transferred to a step-down unit for overnight monitoring. She was at the medication dispenser at 4:15 when Dwight appeared at her shoulder. There are some people asking for you, he said. Out in the main corridor. They said they're from... He lowered his voice. Federal something. They showed me a lot of credentials. How many? 3. Plus a woman in a uniform. She left the department and went into the main corridor and found 3 federal agents and Colonel Ibarra, and also slightly behind the group, Marcus Webb. His wrist was in a proper splint now, and he had a butterfly closure on the laceration above his eye that was better work than her closure strips, and he looked like a man who had slept for 3 hours and considered that adequate. You shouldn't be moving around, she told him. I've been cleared for light activity, he said. By whom? A doctor who is significantly more impressed by my general constitution than you are. She almost smiled. What's happening? Abara stepped forward slightly. We've had a development. Voss, in the 2 hours since his arrest, has been communicating through his attorney in ways that suggest he's exploring a cooperation pathway. This is earlier than I expected. What changed? The server room documentation, Abara said it plainly. Specifically, one set of files in the secondary backup that we didn't know existed until the forensic team pulled the full directory tree this afternoon. Voss knows exactly what's in those files, and he knows that whatever deal he might have constructed for himself before this morning no longer exists in that form. What's in them? Nadia said. Webb answered. Operational records from the overseas supply chain, going back 8 years. Detailed enough to implicate not just Voss and Stroud, but a network of procurement officers across 4 installations and 2 contracting firms. He paused. And the original approval chain for the supply batch that failed, your tourniquet materials. The decision to ship them anyway, every signature. The corridor was quiet around them for a moment. She was aware of the hospital sounds, the PA system, the distant movement of staff, the elevator doors somewhere behind her. Name's the soldier, Webb said, the one who died. His name is in the record, attached to the failure report that was generated internally and then suppressed. He looked at her carefully. You were right. From the beginning, you were right, and the record shows it. She had spent 3 years not being certain whether it mattered anymore, whether being right about something that couldn't be changed was worth anything. She had built a workable answer to that question and carried it with her from city to city and hospital to hospital, and now someone was telling her that the answer she'd built was incomplete. She didn't know exactly what she felt about that yet. She'd figure it out later when she wasn't standing in a hospital corridor. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Formal statement," Abur said. "Your account of the field incident, the report you filed, the follow-up you submitted, and everything from the last 48 hours. We need it recorded and signed." "I can do that tonight." "Not tonight," Abara said. "You've been working a clinical shift for 8 hours after a night with no sleep following a physical altercation in a server room. Tonight you need to eat something and rest." She said it without particular gentleness, just the directness of someone who understood operational capacity. "Tomorrow morning." Nadia considered arguing and concluded it wasn't worth it. "The patients from this morning," she said instead. "I want to check on both of them before I leave." "That's fine," Abara said. She went back to the department. Dale was upstairs in the ICU, and she couldn't go to him directly without being a physician on the case. So she called the unit and spoke to the ICU nurse covering him and confirmed his saturation was holding at 94 and that he was resting, and that the attending had reviewed her notes from the emergency department and amended the overnight plan in ways that incorporated her observations. The nurse said it professionally and without editorializing, and Nadia thanked her and meant it. The patient from Bay 12, she looked up his name in the chart. Terrence Ogilvy, 26, no prior respiratory history, was in the step-down unit and stable. His repeat X-ray at 4 hours showed no progression of the changes she'd flagged. "Guarded optimism," the attending had written. She left the hospital at 5:43. The evening air outside was still warm, Georgia holding on to the heat past all reasonable expectation, and she sat in her car in the staff lot for a few minutes without starting the engine. Her right shoulder was a sustained ache that she'd managed to not think about for most of the afternoon and was now thinking about in detail. She'd wrap it properly tonight. It wasn't structural. She drove to the farmhouse in Merritt's Ferry because it was the only place she could go that wasn't the motel, and Abara had left a key under a specific porch board after they'd left that morning. She found it, went inside, and ate the last of what was in the kitchen. Crackers and peanut butter and the bottom third of a bag of coffee that brewed into something that was almost drinkable, and sat at the table where they'd spread out the thumb drive's contents the night before. She thought about Harlan Voss and his civilian clothes and the way he'd walked into the server room like a man who still believed he had options. She thought about the 4 people who had come through the service entrance behind him and what would have happened if they'd arrived 60 seconds later. She thought about small device she'd found in her bag and what it meant about how long she'd been watched and by whom and with what resources. She thought about her suppressed report and the soldier's name in the record and the year she'd spent after filing the follow-up, trying to build a life that didn't require her to keep pulling at a thread that seemed to go nowhere. The thread had always gone somewhere. She washed her face, wrapped her shoulder, and lay down on the couch. She set her phone, both of them, on the table where she could see the screens, and she closed her eyes. She woke at 2 in the morning with the encrypted phone vibrating. It was Webb. She answered it. "We have a problem," he said. He sounded fully alert, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he hadn't slept at all despite the splint and the butterfly closure and the general advice to rest. "What happened?" Voss's attorney filed an emergency motion at 11 tonight to suppress the server room evidence on the grounds that the access and retrieval was performed by an unauthorized civilian without a warrant. A pause. "A federal judge is reviewing it in the morning. If the motion is granted..." "The chain of evidence breaks," she said. "The manifests are still valid. Webb's documentation is still valid. But the file that contains the original suppression signatures, the one naming the soldier, is on that drive." He stopped. "If it's suppressed, Voss's team will argue the rest is circumstantial enough to negotiate down to something significantly less than what he deserves." She sat up on the couch. The room was dark except for the phone screen. "The access was performed under my reinstated staff credentials," she said. "Administration confirmed the reinstatement at 7:52. I had valid employee access to that building." "I know, that's the argument Abara's legal team is making. But Voss's attorneys are arguing that employee access to patient care areas doesn't constitute authorization to access a restricted server room. The server room required my staff badge. If the badge worked, I was authorized. The counter-argument is that the badge working was a system error given your termination that morning, and that the reinstatement wasn't formally documented until..." "Abara said 7:52, she said. "The formal paperwork timestamp from HR is 8:09, Webb said. 17 minutes after she told you, and you accessed the server room at approximately 8:43. He paused again. "The access itself is solid. The question is going to come down to one thing. What thing? The server room card reader logs its access events with a timestamp and a credential ID. If there's any ambiguity in that log about whether your credential was valid, at the moment of access, Voss's team will push that ambiguity as far as it'll go. Nadia looked at the dark ceiling. Who has access to the card reader logs? Hospital Facilities Management, and whatever federal forensic team was assigned to the server room. He said it carefully. The federal team's copy is secure. The hospital's copy is in a system that Merritt had administrative access to, she finished. Yes. She thought about Merritt. Merritt in the server room, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, watching the room get processed around him with the face of a man who had finally understood the full shape of what he'd walked into. Merritt, who had access to hospital administrative systems that no one had thought to lock down immediately because the immediate priority had been the people in the room. Has anyone pulled the hospital's copy of the log yet? She said. I don't know, Webb said. I flagged it to Ibarra 20 minutes ago. She's working on it. If Merritt accessed that log between the time we left the server room and the time the federal team secured the floor, then we have a potential tampering issue on top of an evidentiary access issue, Webb said. Yes, that's the problem. Nadia was quiet for a moment. When's the hearing? 9 in the morning. She looked at her phone. 2:14. There's a way to confirm, she said. The card reader system keeps a secondary shadow log on a separate server. It's a redundancy built into most hospital security infrastructure. It's not in the same system Merritt had access to. It's in the physical security office on the ground floor, on a standalone terminal that isn't networked to the main hospital system. A pause. How do you know that? Because I spent 6 weeks in that building and I paid attention. She was already sitting up, reaching for her jacket. If the shadow log shows my credential as active at 8:43, the motion fails. If Merritt tampered with the primary log, the shadow log will show the discrepancy. You can't go back there tonight, Webb said. The building has a federal presence, which means I can get in if someone authorizes it. Ibarra, can you get her on the phone right now? A pause. Then, give me 5 minutes. She put on her jacket. Her shoulder told her about it in detail, and she told her shoulder it would get attention after this. She was already at the farmhouse door when the phone buzzed again. Webb, she's on. Then Ibarra's voice, direct and awake in the way of someone who hadn't been asleep either. The shadow log. Yes, Nadia said. I know the system. I should have thought of it. A brief pause that contained something that might have been self-criticism, held in check by the same professional control that kept everything else in check. I'm calling the lead agent on site right now. Can you be at the east entrance in 40 minutes? 30, Nadia said. 30, Ibarra agreed. She drove back to Tidewater with the windows down and the night air coming through and thought about card reader logs and shadow backups and a federal judge reviewing a motion at 9 in the morning and a man with a general's rank and a lawyer and 20 years of institutional standing trying to use all of it as a lever one final time. The east entrance of Callaway General at 2:45 in the morning was not the same building as it was at shift change. The corridors were quieter, the lighting shifted to night mode, the particular stillness of a hospital between midnight and dawn. The federal agent who met her at the door was young and thorough and had clearly been told to facilitate rather than interrogate, and he walked her to the physical security office on the ground floor without unnecessary conversation. The security office was a small room with 4 monitors showing camera feeds and a standalone terminal on a desk that looked like it hadn't been updated since the hospital's last major renovation. She sat down at it, and the security director, a compact, careful man named Yusuf, who'd been called in from home and had arrived with the specific energy of someone who understood that the situation was serious and was setting aside his irritation about the hour, logged her into the system. She found the shadow log in the secondary archive. She pulled up the server room access events for the morning. There it was. Her credential ID, timestamped at 0843. The credential status field showed active, and then, below it, something else. A second entry from the primary system, timestamped at 0917, 34 minutes after her access. A modification event. Credential status retroactively flagged as suspended. She looked at the entry carefully. The modification had been made by an administrative credential. She checked the credential ID against the hospital's staff directory with Yusuf's help. The credential belonged to Garrett Merritt. At 9:17 this morning, while federal agents were still processing the sub-basement, Merritt had accessed the primary log from somewhere in the building and retroactively flagged her credential as suspended, trying to create a record that showed her access was unauthorized at the moment it occurred. He had done it badly. He had not known about the shadow log. He had not had the time to think carefully, or perhaps he had not been a man who did things carefully under pressure, which was a different and more interesting failure. She took photographs of both entries with her phone. She sent them to Ibarra before she stood up. Then she looked at Yusuf. I need a full audit trail of that modification, every access point, every credential, every timestamp. He was already typing. The audit trail took 11 minutes to generate. When it printed, 3 pages, formatted with the dense specificity of system logs, she read it through once and then handed it to the federal agent who had been standing quietly near the door. This goes to Colonel Ibarra's legal team tonight, she said, and to the federal prosecutors before 9 in the morning. He took it without comment. She stood in the physical security office at 3:22 in the morning with the low hum of the camera monitors and the particular silence of a hospital that was never fully silent, and she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not triumph, it wasn't that. Not relief exactly, though there was some of that underneath. It was more like completion. The specific feeling of a thing being finished that had been left unfinished for a long time. But when she walked back toward the east corridor, she stopped. The camera feed on monitor 3 showed the 4th floor administrative corridor. It showed Merritt. He was still in the building. At 3 in the morning. Standing in the corridor outside the administrative suite, not moving, just standing there with his back to the camera, looking at the closed door of his own office. She watched him for a moment. Then she looked at the lead federal agent who was supposed to have Merritt secured and available for federal interview, and she said, "Is Dr. Merritt supposed to be on the 4th floor right now?" The agent looked at the monitor. His expression said everything. He spoke into his radio. And from somewhere above them, through the building's ventilation and its old walls and the 2 floors of concrete between the security office and the 4th floor administrative corridor, there was a sound, brief, sharp, enclosed, that Nadia's training identified in the same instant her mind tried to refuse to, because the alternative was something she'd been hoping not to arrive at, something that changed the shape of everything that happened next. She was moving before the agent finished speaking into his radio. Not running. Running in a hospital at 3 in the morning brought the wrong kind of attention and burned the wrong kind of energy. But moving with the fast, deliberate stride she'd learned in environments where speed and control had to coexist. She went for the stairwell, not the elevator, because elevators were time she didn't have, and she took the stairs 2 at a time with her hand on the rail and her shoulder reminding her of its condition with every pull. 4th floor. She came through the stairwell door into the administrative corridor and stopped. Merritt was on the floor. He was conscious. She established that in the first second, watching his chest move, watching his eyes track toward her when she appeared. He was sitting with his back against the wall beside his office door, which was still closed, and there was blood on his right hand and on the floor beside him, not a large amount, but enough. She crossed to him and went to one knee. "Where?" she said. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the professional authority, not the defensive calculation. Just a man on a floor at 3 in the morning who had run out of the things that had been holding him up. "Hand," he said. His voice was steadier than she expected. She took his right hand and looked at it. A laceration across the palm, deep enough to need closure, but not arterial, not structural. She pulled her jacket off and pressed it against his palm with firm, direct pressure. "Hold this," she said. He brought his left hand up to hold the jacket in place. She looked around the corridor. No one else. She looked at the floor beyond him. A piece of glass. A framed photograph from inside his office. Broken. The kind of thing that happened when someone picked something up and threw it or dropped it or hit a wall with it. "Did someone do this to you?" she said. "No," he said. She looked at him. "I picked up the frame," he said. "I was going to break the glass out. I wanted to—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what I wanted. It slipped." The federal agent came through the stairwell door behind her, radio in hand, and she looked up and said, "He's not in danger. Get me a trauma kit from the supply room. It's at the end of this corridor, door on the left." The agent went. She looked back at Merritt. He was looking at the door of his office. "What were you going to do with the glass?" she said. She asked it the same way she asked clinical questions, directly, without softening it. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she began calculating what the answer might be. "I don't know," he said. "I don't think I had a clear idea." She stayed with that for a moment. It was an honest answer. She'd learned to tell the difference. "Are you having thoughts of harming yourself?" she said. He looked at her. The look had something in it she couldn't name right away, and then she could. It was the particular surprise of a man who had expected to be judged rather than asked. "I don't know," he said again. "Maybe. An hour ago, maybe. And now?" He looked at his hand, at her jacket pressed against his palm, at the broken frame on the floor. "Now I just feel very tired," he said. "Okay," she said. "That's okay." She kept pressure on his hand until the agent came back with the kit. She cleaned the laceration, closed it with 3 sutures from the kit's supply. He hissed once and then went silent, and wrapped it properly. She did it with the same focus she brought to every patient, without the particular contempt she might have thought she'd feel. She had thought sometimes, in the months before this, about what she would say to the man who had fired her for saving lives. She had not imagined it would be this. She had not imagined him on a floor at 3 in the morning, with a broken picture frame and a cut hand, all the authority drained out of him like water from a tipped glass. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "There are people coming to take your statement," she said. "They'll be here in a few minutes. Before they get here, you need to know something." She held his gaze. "Whatever happens in the legal process, whatever you decide to cooperate with or not cooperate with, the patients downstairs are going to be treated correctly. That's already done. That doesn't depend on you anymore." He was quiet. "But you could help other people," she said. "By telling the truth completely and early, you could help close this in a way that protects people you didn't set out to hurt." She stood up. "I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to think about whether you want your record, at the end of all of this, to reflect one more thing you let slide." She left him in the corridor with the federal agent standing nearby and went back downstairs. She sat in the physical security office until 4:15 when Ibarra arrived in person, and then she gave her account of the 4th floor in full, including Merritt's state when she'd found him. "He's going to need a mental health evaluation before any interrogation proceeds," Nadia said. Ibarra looked at her steadily. "You're advocating for him." "I'm advocating for the process," she said. "If he's not in a state to give informed, coherent cooperation, anything he says is going to be challenged. Do it right." "I know how to do it right," Ibarra said. Not harshly. "I know you do," Nadia said. She drove back to this farmhouse as the sky was beginning to move from black to the particular deep blue that came before anything else. The color that didn't have a good name because most people were asleep for it. She got 3 hours on the couch, which was not enough and was what was available, and she woke up at 7:30 with the encrypted phone showing 2 messages from Webb and the regular phone showing one from a Tidewater number she didn't recognize. She checked Webb's messages first. The second one read, "Motion denied. Judge reviewed shadow log and audit trail at 6 a.m. Evidence stands." She held the phone for a moment, then she checked the unknown Tidewater number, a voicemail. She played it. A man's voice, identifying himself as the CEO of Callaway General's parent health system. His voice had the practiced warmth of someone who spent significant time managing institutional relationships, and beneath it she could hear the specific urgency of an executive who understood that something bad had happened on his watch and was moving to position himself correctly relative to it. He said he would like to meet with her at her earliest convenience. He said the words, "deeply sorry" and "full review," and commitment to making this right. He said her name 3 times, which was 2 more times than necessary. She put the phone down and made the rest of the bad coffee. She was at the federal field office in Tidewater by 9:15, and she gave her formal statement over the next 3 hours. It was the most thorough accounting she'd ever given of the field incident, the failed materials, the report she'd filed, the follow-up, the 3 years between, and everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. She gave it to 2 federal attorneys and a criminal investigator, and she gave it with the same precision she'd given everything else. And when she was done, one of the attorneys looked at her and said, "You've been holding all of this for 3 years." "Yes," she said. That must have been... He stopped. I had work to do, she said. I did it. He didn't know what to say to that, which was fine. She didn't need him to. In the weeks that followed, things moved with the particular momentum of a federal investigation that had reached the point where evidence was no longer a limitation. Damon Stroud was arrested at the Beaumont County property 11 hours after the server room documentation was secured. He initially presented his attorney with a prepared statement asserting that all his contracting activity was legally compliant and that any irregularities were the result of third-party suppliers outside his control. His attorney withdrew that statement 4 days later, after the financial forensics team completed their preliminary analysis of the procurement records and presented the numbers to Stroud in a room where the options became clarifying. Stroud cooperated. He cooperated extensively, with the specific thoroughness of a man who had decided that the only remaining variable he could control was the degree to which he mitigated his own exposure. His cooperation produced names, dates, and transaction records that extended the investigation to 2 additional military installations and a third contracting firm that had been operating parallel to his network for at least 4 years without the investigators having connected them. It made the investigation significantly larger and the timeline significantly longer. It was not a clean ending. Clean endings did not exist when institutional corruption had had 6 years to embed itself, and anyone who expected otherwise had not been paying attention. Harlan Voss did not cooperate. He retained a firm with significant federal defense experience, invoked at every available opportunity, and fought the evidentiary motion through 2 subsequent appeals after the initial denial, both of which were also denied. The shadow log audit trail was ruled admissible at every level. The manifests Webb had recovered were ruled admissible. Nadia's field report, restored from the surviving backup copy and entered into the evidentiary record, was admissible. His trial began 4 months after his arrest. It lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the procurement records, the approval signatures, the suppression of Nadia's original field report, and the testimony of 6 cooperating witnesses, including, eventually, Garrett Merritt, who had undergone a mental health evaluation, spent 2 weeks in voluntary inpatient care, and emerged from that process having made a decision about what kind of record he wanted to leave. Merritt's testimony on the 8th day of the trial lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. He described the recruitment process, the nature of the approvals he'd signed, the specific conversation in which Voss's intermediary had made clear what the consequences of non-cooperation would be, and the morning he'd fired Nadia Reeves because he'd understood that she noticed things, and that someone who noticed things was a liability to a system that required people not to notice. He said that last part without apparent calculation. He said it like a man who had been carrying it and had decided to put it down. Voss was convicted on 11 of 13 counts, including procurement fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and the specific charge connected to the suppression of Nadia's field report, which the prosecution had framed under a federal whistleblower protection statute that carried its own penalty structure. The sentencing was 8 months after the arrest. 12 years. Stripped of rank and benefits. A fine that would consume whatever assets weren't already frozen. His attorney delivered a statement outside the courthouse describing the verdict as a miscarriage of justice and promising appeal. The appeal was filed, reviewed, and denied 14 months later. Nadia was not in the courthouse on sentencing day. She was in an emergency department in Charleston, 3 states over, on the 6th week of a travel contract. She got the news from Webb via the encrypted phone, which she still carried, and she read the message twice and then put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. She had a patient in Bay 4 with a suspected dissecting aortic aneurysm who needed someone paying attention. Merritt received a suspended sentence and 5 years of probation, contingent on his full cooperation with the ongoing investigation and the civil proceedings that followed. He surrendered his medical license during the process, not as a condition of the plea agreement, but voluntarily 2 months before sentencing, in a formal letter to the Georgia Medical Board that was brief and specific and contained no self-justification. His attorney had advised against it. He'd done it anyway. Nadia heard about the letter from Dwight, the charge nurse, who had heard about it from someone in administration and called her because he thought she should know. She appreciated the call. "How's the department?" she asked him. "Different," he said. "There's an interim trauma director. She's good. Not as good as she thinks she is, but she's learning." He paused. "There's a position being built." Emergency Response Coordinator, cross-training program for the trauma staff. The health system executive has been talking to people about it for 3 months. Another pause. Your name keeps coming up. Dwight, she said. I'm just telling you what I hear. How are the patients from the chemical incident? Dale went home, he said. Terrence Ogilvy is back at work. Dale sent a card to the nursing station. We put it up. A pause. He wrote your name in it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Tell him I'm glad he's home, she said. The formal military review of Nadia's service record was completed 5 months after Voss's conviction. It was conducted by a 3-person panel through the Inspector General's office, with Ibarra as the coordinating officer. The review was administrative rather than ceremonial, which suited Nadia because she had always been suspicious of ceremony as a substitute for substance. The findings were entered into her official record and declassified at the appropriate level. Her field report was restored, redated to its original submission date, and formally noted as substantiated. The follow-up she had submitted was noted as improperly closed. The materials failure she had documented was confirmed as connected to the fraudulent supply batch, and the record of the soldier who had died. Private First Class Antoine Devereaux, 22 years old from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was amended to reflect that the equipment failure contributing to his death had been documented at the time, reported through proper channels, and deliberately suppressed. His family had been notified as part of a broader notification process covering the families of all personnel affected by the fraudulent supply chain. Nadia did not know exactly what those notifications contained, because they were handled through military liaison officers and family assistance coordinators, as they should have been. She knew the process happened. She thought about Antoine Devereaux's family receiving a letter that said, in some formal and inadequate way, that what had happened to him was not invisible, that someone had tried to say so and been silenced, and that the silence was now broken. She didn't know if that was enough for them. She doubted it was. She didn't think enough was really the operative concept when a 22-year-old didn't come home. But she knew that the alternative, the version where nothing was ever said, where the suppression held and the record stayed clean and the network kept operating and more people used equipment that wasn't what the invoice said it was worse. She had always known that. It had been the thing that made the 3 years of carrying it without resolution bearable. The knowledge that she had tried, that she had been right, and that even when the system routed around her, the act of trying had mattered. It had mattered because it left a trace. The backup copy that survived the deletion attempt survived, because she had originally filed the report. The thread Webb pulled had her field documentation at its end. Systems that try to erase things are not always successful, and the reason they are not always successful is that people do the work of creating the record in the first place, even when they believe no one is listening. She had believed no one was listening. She'd done it anyway. She met Webb in person 3 months after the sentencing, at a coffee shop in Atlanta where he was attending a federal conference and she was in the middle of a transit day between assignments. His wrist had healed cleanly. The laceration above his eye had left a small scar that was going to fade to nearly nothing within the year. "How's the shoulder?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "It was fine in 2 weeks. You were moving it wrong for about 6 days. I was aware of that." He smiled slightly. "What are you doing next?" "Contract in Birmingham starts in 2 weeks. Level 1 Trauma Center." She drank her coffee. "You?" "Still in the same work," he said. "Different case. There's always a different case." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "Ibarra asked me to pass something along. She didn't want to do it formally because she thought you'd find the formality annoying." Nadia raised an eyebrow. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell Reeves that what she did in that server room was not what I asked her to do. It was more than I asked her to do, and the difference between those two things is why it worked." Nadia considered that for a moment. "Tell her I'll take it," she said. She took the Birmingham contract. The trauma center was a different environment from Callaway General, larger, more complex, with a staff culture that had been shaped by a series of leadership transitions, and was in the particular stage of institutional life where people were tired of change and resistant to new faces. She was a new face. She was used to that. She worked her first shift and did it well, and the second shift, and by the end of the first week she had 2 nurses who sought her out, specifically when they had questions they didn't want to take to the attending. and one resident who had begun, cautiously, watching how she handled incoming trauma cases with the specific attention of someone who understood they were seeing something worth understanding. She didn't explain herself. She didn't announce her history or her credentials or the things that had happened in Tidewater. She showed up, did the work, and let the work speak. That had always been the approach. It had been, in the long run, the correct one. She thought about that sometimes, about whether she should have fought harder, earlier, whether the 3 years of carrying the suppressed report without escalating to a higher channel had been a mistake. She had answers to that question that changed depending on the day, and she had made her peace with the fact that they changed, because that was honest, and because the alternative was a kind of certainty she didn't have and didn't trust in anyone who claimed to have it. What she knew, with actual certainty, was small. She knew that Antoine Devereaux deserved a record that told the truth about what happened to him. She knew that the patients in that trauma bay on the morning of the training accident deserved someone who moved when everyone else froze. She knew that Dale, with his broad hands and his bewildered face, had sat in a hospital bed and asked if he was going to be okay, and that someone had to be the person who stayed close and told him the truth in a way that he could hold on to. She was that person. She had always been that person. In every building she'd walked through, and every city she'd worked in, and every shift she'd clocked in for with 13 minutes to spare. It wasn't a dramatic thing. It didn't feel like a mission. Most days it felt like work. Hard, specific, sometimes thankless, never finished. But she had learned, eventually, that the absence of drama was not the same as the absence of meaning. The two had been confused in a lot of the stories she'd been told about what it looked like to matter, and she had spent enough time now at the actual edges of things to know the difference. She mattered when she was accurate, when she was present, when she noticed what was in front of her and responded to it without waiting for someone with more authority to tell her it was acceptable to respond. That was it. That was the whole thing. Months later, the health system executive from Tidewater reached her by email, through a professional address she'd set up after Callaway General, and the email was more direct than the voicemail had been. Less managed, less careful. He wrote that the cross-training coordinator position had been formally approved, that it would involve designing emergency response protocols that would be adopted system-wide, and that it included a clinical advisory role in the ongoing restructuring of the trauma department following Merritt's departure. He wrote that the search committee had considered other candidates and concluded that none of them had her specific combination of experience. He wrote, "We failed you. That's not something I can fix with a job offer, and I'm not trying to. But this position is real, and the work is important, and we'd like it to be yours if you want it." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She thought about Tidewater, Georgia, about Callaway General's trauma bay, and the 11 soldiers, and the specific weight of a 14-gauge needle going into the second intercostal space when someone was running out of time. She thought about the extended stay motel, and the bad highway sandwiches, and the raccoon in the tree line that had made her heart rate spike at the worst possible moment. She thought about Dwight telling her Dale had sent a card. She wrote back. She said she would think about it, which was true, and that she appreciated the honesty of his framing, which was also true. She said she had a contract in Birmingham that ran for 8 more weeks, and that she wouldn't make a decision before it concluded, because she didn't make decisions about where to go next from the middle of where she was. He wrote back immediately. "Take the time. The position will be here." She put the phone away and went back to her shift. The resident who had been watching her work found her at the nurse's station at the end of the evening and stood there for a moment in the way of someone who was working up to asking something. "Go ahead," she said. "How did you know?" he said. "The patient in Bay 6 today. The internal bleeding presentation was atypical. You caught it about 12 minutes before the imaging would have confirmed it. How did you know?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I've seen a lot of presentations," she said. "Some of them in places that didn't have imaging." He absorbed that. "Is that something you can teach?" She looked at him. He was 28, maybe 29, with the residency exhaustion written into him, the way it got written into everyone, and underneath it something that hadn't been worn down yet, the specific alertness of someone who was still genuinely trying to understand rather than just trying to perform understanding. She had been that person once. She thought she still was, in different ways. "Yes," she said, "some of it. Come in 10 minutes early tomorrow, and I'll show you what I was looking at before the imaging." He nodded. He started to say something and stopped, and she knew the thing he'd stopped himself from saying was probably thank you, which residents were often awkward about, and she let him go without requiring it. She clocked out at the end of her shift and stood in the parking lot for a minute in the November air, which was actually cold now, properly cold, the kind of cold that required a real coat rather than the seasonal optimism she'd been operating on for the past 2 weeks. She looked up at the hospital behind her, 12 floors, half the windows lit, the business of keeping people alive going on in every one of them in 100 small ways that nobody was making a story out of. She was 32 years old. She had been a soldier and a medic and a whistleblower that nobody had listened to, and a travel nurse in 4 cities, and the woman who'd walked into an abandoned facility in the middle of a Georgia night and changed the direction of a federal investigation because she'd been in exactly the right place with exactly the right skills and exactly the right refusal to look away from what was in front of her. Nobody had put her there. She had put herself there, one shift at a time, one city at a time, one decision at a time, including the decision 3 years ago to file a report that she believed would go nowhere and to file it anyway because Antoine Devereaux deserved someone who tried. She had not saved him. She needed to be honest about that, always. She had not saved him, and no outcome in a courtroom or a federal case file changed that. What she had done was make sure that what happened to him was seen eventually by people with the power to say it was wrong. That was a smaller thing than saving him. It was not nothing. The parking lot light above her flickered once, steadied. She put on her coat and walked to her car. There were things she still didn't know how to carry easily. The year after the field incident, the specific weight of a report filed in good faith and then buried. The 3 years of building a functional life around a wound she couldn't talk about in the places she lived and worked. She would probably always carry them with some difficulty. That was honest. That was human. But she had also learned something in the past months that she hadn't known how to articulate before. That the people who dismiss you are not always wrong about everything. Sometimes the system really is against you. Sometimes the protocols really are inadequate. Sometimes the person who's most qualified to handle a situation genuinely is not the one with the highest title in the room. And when that's true, when you know it's true, when you can see it clearly and feel it in the way you feel things you've trained yourself to trust, the question is not whether you have permission. The question is whether you're willing to move. She had always been willing to move. She started the car and drove into the city, into the ordinary dark of a Tuesday night, carrying everything she was. The things that had been done to her, and the things she'd done in return, and the patients she'd kept alive and the ones she hadn't been able to, the suppressed report and the shadow log, and the name on the amended record and the card that Dale had sent to the nursing station, carrying all of it forward, which was the only direction available. It was, when she thought about it, enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was everything. She didn't explain herself. She didn't announce her history or her credentials or the things that had happened in Tidewater. She showed up, did the work, and let the work speak. That had always been the approach. It had been, in the long run, the correct one. She thought about that sometimes, about whether she should have fought harder, earlier, whether the 3 years of carrying the suppressed report without escalating to a higher channel had been a mistake. She had answers to that question that changed depending on the day, and she had made her peace with the fact that they changed because that was honest, and because the alternative was a kind of certainty she didn't have and didn't trust in anyone who claimed to have it. What she knew, with actual certainty, was small. She knew that Antoine Devereaux deserved a record that told the truth about what happened to him. She knew that the patients in that trauma bay on the morning of the training accident deserved someone who moved when everyone else froze. She knew that Dale, with his broad hands and his bewildered face, had sat in a hospital bed and asked if he was going to be okay, and that someone had to be the person who stayed close and told him the truth in a way that he could hold on to. She was that person. She had always been that person. In every building she'd walked through and every city she'd worked in and every shift she'd clocked in for with 13 minutes to spare. It wasn't a dramatic thing. It didn't feel like a mission. Most days it felt like work. Hard, specific, sometimes thankless, never finished. But she had learned eventually that the absence of drama was not the same as the absence of meaning. The two had been confused in a lot of the stories she'd been told about what it looked like to matter. And she had spent enough time now at the actual edges of things to know the difference. She mattered when she was accurate, when she was present, When she noticed what was in front of her and responded to it without waiting for someone with more authority to tell her it was acceptable to respond. That was it. That was the whole thing. Months later, the health system executive from Tidewater reached her by email, through a professional address she'd set up after Callaway General, and the email was more direct than the voicemail had been, less managed, less careful. He wrote that the cross-training coordinator position had been formally approved, that it would involve designing emergency response protocols that would be adopted system-wide, and that it included a clinical advisory role in the ongoing restructuring of the trauma department following Merritt's departure. He wrote that the search committee had considered other candidates and concluded that none of them had her specific combination of experience. He wrote, "We failed you. That's not something I can fix with a job offer, and I'm not trying to. But this position is real, and the work is important, and we'd like it to be yours if you want it." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She thought about Tidewater, Georgia, about Callaway General's trauma bay and the 11 soldiers and the specific weight of a 14-gauge needle going into the second intercostal space when someone was running out of time. She thought about the extended stay motel and the bad highway sandwiches and the raccoon in the tree line that had made her heart rate spike at the worst possible moment. She thought about Dwight telling her Dale had sent a card. She wrote back. She said she would think about it, which was true, and that she appreciated the honesty of his framing, which was also true. She said she had a contract in Birmingham that ran for 8 more weeks, and that she wouldn't make a decision before it concluded, because she didn't make decisions about where to go next from the middle of where she was. He wrote back immediately, "Take the time. The position will be here." She put the phone away and went back to her shift. The resident who had been watching her work found her at the nurse's station at the end of the evening and stood there for a moment in the way of someone who was working up to asking something. "Go ahead," she said. "How did you know?" he said. "The patient in Bay 6 today. The internal bleeding presentation was atypical. You caught it about 12 minutes before the imaging would have confirmed it. How did you know?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I've seen a lot of presentations," she said. "Some of them in places that didn't have imaging." He absorbed that. "Is that something you can teach?" She looked at him. He was 28, maybe 29, with the residency exhaustion written into him the way it got written into everyone, and underneath it something that hadn't been worn down yet. The specific alertness of someone who was still genuinely trying to understand rather than just trying to perform understanding. She had been that person once. She thought she still was, in different ways. "Yes," she said. "Some of it. Come in 10 minutes early tomorrow, and I'll show you what I was looking at before the imaging." He nodded. He started to say something and stopped, and she knew the thing he'd stopped himself from saying was probably "thank you," which residents were often awkward about, and she let him go without requiring it. She clocked out at the end of her shift and stood in the parking lot for a minute in the November air, which was actually cold now, properly cold. The kind of cold that required a real coat rather than the seasonal optimism she'd been operating on for the past 2 weeks. She looked up at the hospital behind her. 12 floors, half the windows lit. The business of keeping people alive going on in every one of them, in 100 small ways that nobody was making a story out of. She was 32 years old. She had been a soldier and a medic and a whistleblower that nobody had listened to, and a travel nurse in 4 cities, and the woman who'd walked into an abandoned facility in the middle of a Georgia night and changed the direction of a federal investigation because she'd been in exactly the right place with exactly the right skills and exactly the right refusal to look away from what was in front of her. Nobody had put her there. She had put herself there, one shift at a time, one city at a time, one decision at a time, including the decision 3 years ago to file a report that she believed would go nowhere, and to file it anyway because Antoine Devereaux deserved someone who tried. She had not saved him. She needed to be honest about that, always. She had not saved him, and no outcome in a courtroom or a federal case file changed that. What she had done was make sure that what happened to him was seen, eventually, by people with the power to say it was wrong. That was a smaller thing than saving him. It was not nothing. The parking lot light above her flickered once, steadied. She put on her coat and walked to her car. There were things she still didn't know how to carry easily. The year after the field incident, the specific weight of a report filed in good faith and then buried. The 3 years of building a functional life around a wound she couldn't talk about in the places she lived and worked. She would probably always carry them with some difficulty. That was honest. That was human. But she had also learned something in the past months that she hadn't known how to articulate before. That the people who dismiss you are not always wrong about everything. Sometimes the system really is against you. Sometimes the protocols really are inadequate. Sometimes the person who's most qualified to handle a situation genuinely is not the one with the highest title in the room. And when that's true, when you know it's true, when you can see it clearly and feel it in the way you feel things you've trained yourself to trust, the question is not whether you have permission. The question is whether you're willing to move. She had always been willing to move. She started the car and drove into the city, into the ordinary dark of a Tuesday night, carrying everything she was. The things that had been done to her, and the things she'd done in return, and the patients she'd kept alive and the ones she hadn't been able to, the suppressed report, and the shadow log, and the name on the amended record, and the card that Dale had sent to the nursing station, carrying all of it forward, which was the only direction available. It was, when she thought about it, enough. It was, in fact, more than enough.